My name is Elliot Ackerman. I served in the Marine Corps from 2003 to 2009, and then thereafter served at CIA as a paramilitary operations officer. So I served as an infantry officer in 1st Battalion, 8th Marine Regiment. From 2004 to 2005, we were deployed in Al-Anbar province, Iraq. We fought in the Fallujah battle in November 2004. Then when I was a 1-8, we also deployed with the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit. And when Israel invaded Lebanon, we were the group of Marines that helped run the evacuation of all the American citizens out of Beirut. I then went over to what was then 2nd Marine Special Operations Battalion at MARSOC, which is now 2nd Raider Battalion, and we deployed to Afghanistan, to Western Afghanistan in 2008. Left MARSOC, then went over to the agency as a paramilitary officer, and at which point just sort of deployed all over Afghanistan. So today I am a writer. I've written 8 books, 6 novels, 2 memoirs. My most recent memoir is a book called The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan, which chronicles sort of the long arc of the war, but also the evacuation in the summer of 2021. Novels I've written called Halcyon, and it is set in an alternate 2004 and deals with controversy surrounding a Civil War memorial. But I've also written military thrillers like the book 2034 that I co-authored with retired Admiral James Stavridis, and then also novels about Afghanistan, Green on Blue, or the war in Syria, Dark at the Crossing. And in addition to that, I'm a contributing writer at The Atlantic, where I also work as a journalist. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't gone into the military. I think I probably would have tried to become like a professional skateboarder. I don't know, but I don't think I would have wound up as a writer. I think there would have been like some intermediate chapter that would have had me, skateboarding off something, surfing off of something, or jumping off of something. My nickname was Cracker, and it was given to me by my team sergeant at 2nd Raider Battalion. So we were at a team party one time, and I was dancing kind of like this. And it rhymes with my name, Ackerman. It's like, man, you dance like a white boy, Cracker. So I was and have always been hence Cracker. When I joined the military, I didn't come from a family that had a particularly long or illustrious military history. My grandfather had served in the Second World War in the Naval Reserve as an engineer in World War II, and I knew about his service. My father had served in the National Guard, in the Vietnam era, but had never deployed. So it wasn't something that was, very present in my family. That being said, everyone in my family was supportive of my decision to serve, which I made before September 11th, and I only bring that up because it was it was peacetime. But my decision to join the military kind of came down to really 3 variables. The first was I grew up overseas. I think growing up overseas just gave me an outsider's perspective of what it means to be an American, and with that perspective, a desire to give back. I would say the second reason I joined was I wanted a job where whether I was good at my job or bad at my job really mattered. And the last reason I would say I joined is like I was that kid who never stopped playing with his G.I. Joes. Like I had an innate fascination with the military. So when you combine all of that, it led me into the Marine Corps. I think what military training really does, particularly in some of these more intense and higher end courses, is it just sort of expands your capacity and your understanding of your own capacities, what you're able to deal with and to push through. I mean, whether it's, physically or psychologically, you're really pushed outside of your comfort envelope. And then successfully navigating these training courses, I think gives, people a real sense of confidence that, I made it through that. And if I can make it through that, I can make it through anything. And, my experience, at least, in terms of, sleep deprivation or being cold or being exhausted, nothing I ever did in combat was more difficult than anything I had to do in training. I mean, the thing I would offer is that death can often be very banal. You don't even know that you nearly died sometimes. I mean, I was in vehicles that were like hit with IEDs. I was hit with one IED where I had my window down, and maybe as we were leaving it, like an hour before, I was like, oh, maybe I'll roll up my window. And I had not rolled up that window, I would have lost half my face. Um, so there's like things like that where I can be like, oh, I nearly died. But then there's a sort of the more banal stuff where just you're sitting there in a firefighter, and you're watching kind of the dust maybe 3 feet away from you kick up because someone's shooting at you. Did I nearly die? I don't know. So, war is filled with a gazillion sort of, would've, could'ves, or should'ves, all the things that might have happened. And frankly, I don't dwell on it too much because I think it will drive you insane. In combat, your imagination can be, I think, a true liability, because if you sit there in combat in these moments where, you're being called upon to take action, and you start imagining all the things that can happen to you, all of the, close calls that, might kill you, you'll not only will you go insane, you'll be stuck in a state of utter paralysis. First day of the battle in Fallujah, the company I was with was held in reserve. So our battalion was assigned to seize the government center, which was right in the middle of the city. And so 2 companies, Bravo and Charlie companies, were tasked with sort of fighting up 800 meters into the city. And they were going to open a channel for us to come through. And we were going to go 800 meters into the city, and then about like another 800 meters deeper, our company would then sort of, in a classic mechanized raid, seize the government center. And then over the course of the next day, those other 2 companies would fight up to get even with us. And then very early on the morning of November 10th, 2004, our company crossed the line of departure into the city. It was pretty quiet at first, and I think we got into the government center about 4 or 5 in the morning, and we had rehearsed this mechanized raid over and over and over again. And so we started moving building to building. We were the main effort assault platoon, so we were moving very quickly through all these buildings. And by around the time the sun was coming up, we had assumed a platoon battle position on the southern end of the government center, which at this point made us the southernmost element for our entire battalion. And then when the sun came up, some all hell broke loose. And we were in a running gunfight for the entirety of that day. And so we were fighting basically with the insurgents who were on the southern end of the highway. We were on the north end of that highway all day long. And that kind of became their main line of resistance throughout the day. During the course of that day, one of our other platoons, there was a friendly fire incident where GBU 38 was dropped on that platoon, and a bunch of Marines were hurt. We started taking some casualties throughout the day. Our weapons platoon commander was killed that afternoon. And by the end of the day, we were exhausted. And our company commander that night basically let us know that the entire battalion, which had now sort of fought up even with us, the entire battalion was going to cross Highway 10 the next morning. So, one of the first principles of urban combat is before you launch an attack, you gain a foothold. And so he told our platoon that we would gain a foothold for the battalion, and we were going to infiltrate across Highway 10 in the middle of the night. We identified this one building where we would gain that foothold for the battalion on the southern side of the highway where all the insurgents were. And so he said, all right, well, we're going to call in an AC-130 just to do some prep fires on this building, to make sure there are any bad guys in there. And as we ran into that building, it was just a smoke and debris. You couldn't see a thing, and the AC-130 had done too good of a job. And the entire back wall of that building had been blown out, so we couldn't fight from it. So at that point, the whole platoon were consolidating in this building. We're pretty exposed, and the sort of, the question is, all right, well, what are we going to do? And we started setting up basically a defensive position in the middle of the night, consolidated it. And when the sun came up that morning, the entire battalion was scheduled to begin its attack at like 9 a.m. The sun came up around, 6:30 or 7. And we just started seeing, little groups of like 5 and 6 al-Qaeda and Iraq guys, just sort of, insurgents bebopping up towards Highway 10, which had been the front line the day before, just totally oblivious to the fact that we were there. And so our entire platoon just started opening up on these guys. But after about an hour or so, they quickly figured out that we were consolidated in this house, and they started surrounding us. And at this point, too, my battalion that was back in the government center, they were also heavily engaged. So the time of our battalion attack kind of kept getting pushed back. And by the early afternoon, we had taken some casualties. My platoon sergeant had been shot in the head. One of the machine gunners in the platoon had been shot through the femoral artery and was bleeding really badly. And so I called in a medevac. And as soon as they left the government center, one of them was taken out a catastrophic kill with an RPG. So it was just sort of lying there in the middle of Highway 10, on fire, burning. But we're still sort of surrounded at this point. We can't get out. It's only getting more intense. And it's sort of early afternoon. I was on the radio with my company commander at one point. Anyone who wasn't manning a fighting position was sitting there listening to that conversation because they could overhear him on the radio and they could see me talking. And they knew that however that conversation went meant whether or not we were going to sort of have to run out into the jaws, whatever was awaiting us further south in the city, or whether or not we'd be able to hold tight for 3 or 4 hours. I didn't have my way. And we got told that we needed to push. So I remember I ran downstairs to the candy store. There's only one door in or out of that building. I said, well, let me see if I can even get us out of here. And I tucked my head out the door, and there was like a PKM that had a line of fire right down this alleyway. And it just stitched up the alleyway. And I kind of come like barreling back in through the door. I was trying to figure out, well, how are we going to get the platoon out of this building? Because we go out this door, it's going to be really, really bad. And I had this great combat engineer who was attached with our platoon. A guy named Davies, who was a corporal. So Davies kind of sits there, and Davies is like, hey, sir, I bet this building's built pretty strong. I bet if I pack a bunch of C4 on the far wall, we all go to the other side of the building, I could blow out the back wall and make us a new door. And so no one else had any better ideas. So I was like, all right, well, that's what we're going to do. Davies stacks a bunch of C4 against one side of the house. We all get to the other side. He pulls the fuse, huge explosion. We're all got our fingers crossed that the house isn't going to collapse on us. It doesn't. And then we all just go barreling out the door that Davies had made. And at that point, we were into the assault. And the platoon, we basically just for the next 5 hours, it took about 5 hours to go 400 meters, are just kind of fighting up to phase line blue. And, to this day, so much of that assault is blurred to me. Kind of time just sort of takes on these weird proportions. We finally make it to phase line blue. It's getting dark at this point. We all barrel into this house. And I get up to the roof of that house with the platoon. And I know, that we're not in good shape at this point, but I don't really understand the scope of it. And I lost my platoon sergeant that morning. So the platoon guide, who was a young sergeant at this point, was the senior NCO in the platoon. And I said to him, Menard, I got to know, how many combat effectives do we have? And so he sort of ran downstairs and started counting people. And we started the day with 46 Marines. And when he found me, he's like, we got 21 combat effectives. So that was sort of the first, 36 hours of the battle for us, and then it went on for a month.
Getting older hits you in these little ambushes you don't see coming. One day you wake up and the knees sound like you're stepping on a bag of pretzels. Recovery takes longer than the workout itself, and the hairline, well, it starts its own retrograde operation. I've felt all of that, especially after years of wear and tear overseas and in training, which is exactly why I'm obsessed with Bubs Naturals. Not because someone handed me a script, but because it actually helped me feel like I took some crown back. Most people don't realize this, but somewhere in your mid-20s, your body quietly starts producing less collagen every year. And collagen is basically the connective tissue of your life. It keeps your joints moving, your skin healthy, your hair and nails strong. Once it drops, you feel it. Bubs collagen peptides have been a way to rebuild some of what time, and in my case, the Marine Corps took out of me. My joints hurt less, recovery feels cleaner, and even small things like nails and skin look healthier. It's not magic, it's just replacing what your body stopped making. And it couldn't be easier. I throw 1 scoop into my morning coffee, it dissolves instantly. No grit, no taste, no weird science experiment texture, just coffee that happens to make me feel noticeably better. But here's where Bubs is different from every other supplement company out there. The entire brand is a tribute to Glenn "Bub" Doherty, a Navy SEAL who gave his life saving Americans in Benghazi. Glenn was the kind of guy who dedicated himself to lifting others up, and that ethos is the backbone of this company. They donate 10% of all profits to charity, starting with the Glenn Doherty Memorial Foundation. And they back up that legacy with standards most companies won't even attempt. No sugar, no fillers, no junk. Third-party tested, NSF certified for sport. If you want to live better longer, Bubs is giving our listeners 20% off for a limited time. Just head to bubsnaturals.com and use the code COMBAT at checkout. And after you order, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please make sure to tell them it was Combat Story. It genuinely supports the show and helps us keep bringing these conversations to you. And now, back to our show.
Well, I covered the war in Syria for a number of years, and I was basically living with a house with some NGO workers, and one of them was a Syrian democratic activist who'd fled to Turkey named Abed. And one day I'm basically sitting in the kitchen of our apartment. I was making dinner, and he walks in. He's like, Elliot, how are you? I'm like, hey, Abed, how was your day? He's like, very, very good. He's like, well, Elliot, today I was doing some research in Achakale. He's like, I was in a Achakale refugee camp today, Elliot, and I met a guy who I think you should meet. And I was like, okay, Abed, like, who's the guy? He's like, well, he fought for al-Qaeda in Iraq, but I just think the two of you would really get along. And so, I'm up for anything. So I said, all right, well, like, let's set up the meeting. And so Abed set up the meeting. And I said, well, what are we going to tell him? Why are we going to tell him that I want to meet him? Because I was not, particularly at that point in the war, I wasn't sure I wanted to, how it would go over if I told this former AQI member that, I was a Marine and I just want to hang out in the refugee camp with him. And Abed agreed. And I said, well, listen, why don't we just tell him that you were a journalist? And that was why you were in Iraq, and we'll see how things go from there. So a couple of days later, Abed and I, we drive down to Achakale, and his name was Abu Hassar. And so we basically pick up Abu Hassar in the camp, and we drive nearby to a shop. We're basically just going to have some tea. And the idea being, two veterans of the Iraq War sit down, and we talk about our war, but we fought on opposite sides. So very cool. Abu Hassar and I start talking, with kind of no time at all. We build up a little bit of rapport. I then feel comfortable saying to him, actually the reason I want to talk to you was, I was a Marine. I fought in Al-Anbar province. It turned out he was Syrian from Deir ez-Zor. He had also fought in Al-Anbar province. And so we're talking about his experience of fighting in the war. He said, I figured you might have been a Marine. That's why you wanted to talk to me. We were sort of having this like very intense conversation that was going on at that point for a few hours. And I was very interested in to understand, what the war was like from his perspective, and the same thing he from mine. Abed is translating the entire time because Abu Hassar doesn't speak English, and my Arabic certainly wasn't going to cut it. And I had drawn to try to figure out where he had come in from in Deir ez-Zor. I'd sort of drawn in my notebook just like a map of the Iraqi-Syrian border and the Tigris and the Euphrates. And after a couple hours, Abed, finally exhausted from translating, is like, Elliot, I need a break. I got to go use the men's room. So he gets up to go have his break. And as intensely as Abu Hassar and I had been having this conversation, talking about our wars, now we couldn't communicate because Abed wasn't there anymore. And suddenly now we're like as awkward as two like 12-year-olds on their first date. And then he sort of leans over and he takes my pencil from me and he grabs the notebook where I had the map and he writes down the name of the name of a place, and the next to it he puts a number and he hands me the map. And I'm like, oh wait, I get what he's doing. And I put a number next to his number. And then sort of as the two of us had sort of once chased one another around the country, our hands are kind of chasing each other around this map, and we're filling in all the places and the dates on the map. Because those numbers were the dates, and we wanted to see if our dates lined up at one place. where basically, in effect, we had been fighting one another at the exact same time. And as we were doing this and Abed wasn't there, what occurred to me was that even had Abed been there to translate for us, there was no way he could have translated this, because this was a language that transcended anything that was spoken. It was a knowledge that he and I had, and it was one of place names and dates, and where the two of us had fought and in many ways been defined. The entire premise of my going to meet Abu Hassar was predicated on an intuition that I had. I knew that the wars had defined me. And throughout the wars, it always felt as though I was engaged, in like a shadow dance. Like I could feel my dance partner moving against me, pushing against me, but I could never see them. And I had an intuition that, as curious as I was about my partner, who I'd been engaged in this war with and this shadow dance with, that he had a similar curiosity about me. And so the bond that existed between us was, we knew that we had these experiences that had in so many ways defined us. And we wanted to truly understand that experience. But the only way to have that higher level understanding was to sit down with the person who had defined you as well. And that was what that meeting, and actually a friendship that formed afterwards, was all predicated on. Well, I think we tell ourselves stories in order to create form and meaning around events, or put another way, just to simply understand what happens. So anyone who's ever been in a firefight probably knows that as soon as it's all over, all the guys who participated in it, when they get back to base, or whether they're sitting back at the patrol base, or, the guys start talking about what happened. And usually like with a lot of intensity, because they're trying to understand and put a shape around what they just experienced and sort of fill in the holes and the gaps of their own knowledge. So, so for me, telling stories has put a shape to my experience, and it's helped me understand what I think of those experiences. When I was younger, I looked back to the war that had been fought before, and that was the Vietnam War. And I read books like Jim Wedd's Fields of Fire or Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, and that was how I understood what experiences I might have in the military. So when a war ends, the people who fought on it become the custodians of a certain memory. And it's important for us to tell those stories, because I'm sure that in however many years, there's going to be some 17 or 18-year-old version of Elliot Ackerman who's thinking about going in the military. They want to know what it might be like, and they're going to reach back to the generation that came before to try to understand their experiences so that they may understand the experience that they could potentially have. On my way to being a Marine officer, I was actually an ROTC midshipman. I was so enthusiastic about going into the military. At the time, my family lived around Washington, D.C., that during Christmas break, I would volunteer as an unpaid intern in the Pentagon, like running papers between offices. And there was a SEAL who worked in that office. He was a retired SEAL. One morning, I was at my desk, like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, at 6:30 in the morning, 2 days before Christmas. And he sort of wandered in and he looked at me. And he basically said, like, "Hey, kid, let me give you some advice." And I was like, "Yes, sir, what is it?" And he said, "I've known a lot of Marines, and the ones who are the best Marine officers never lose sight of who they were before they became Marines. So just make sure you don't either." And that's always stood with me. The best Marines, the guys I've worked with who were, really the most creative, the ones who could look at problems from myriad perspectives. There were always guys who you could see who they were before they became Marines. They never completely allowed themselves to be consumed by their identity as Marines. So I would say that a trait of any good Marine officer or infantry officer is to really never lose sight of like who you are. Because who you are as an individual, even though that's sometimes a dirty word in the Marine Corps, is really where you're going to offer value to both your Marines and your unit. The last trait I would say, for a good Marine infantry officer is like, you got to love your Marines. Like, it is a tough job. It's a tough job when you're in garrison, and, sometimes your unit might not be performing exactly how you want to perform. And it's an extremely tough job in war where, where people are getting hurt, wounded and killed, and you're asked to do very, very difficult things. And, you have to love your Marines. You guys all have to, have the esprit de corps, which I think is just another name for love. It's going to sustain you through those difficult situations. And Marine officers really need to be able to express that type of love with how they treat their units. So I would say that those two traits are never lose sight of who you are, and you got to have it within you to love those Marines.